Hi, everyone. I'm happy to introduce you to Gershom. He is a longtime Haskell contributor, and he's currently a co-maintainer of Hackish, an administrator for Haskell.org infrastructure.
This has been a really inspiring conference so far and continues to be in terms of having a lot of presentations of really cool sort of techniques and ideas and things that are, sort of exciting to go out and try to apply. And they're all the cool things we like to do when we're programming. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the mood really down, which is to say I'm going to talk about difficulties. And so here we go. Here's a slide that is common in a lot of engineering, not software engineering, but engineering courses, but is not too common, I think, and not overused in our neck of the woods. This is the Hyatt Regency Skyway collapse in 1981, Kansas City. The reason it's important is this was an entirely preventable failure of design that 120 people were killed in this, but there were a lot of lessons learned, and it really changed the face of how people sort of did sign off and sort of check off and did the design process from top to finish of in engineering, because this was a really horrifying disaster, and there was an extensive investigation afterwards. And then the reason I'm raising this is because engineering as a broad discipline has a lot of history of, well, on the one hand, bad things happening, and on the other hand, people understanding why they happened and how to do things differently. And in software engineering, I don't think we've really learned from that process and that history. We don't talk about our equivalents to these, or we don't talk about these. Now, just as a cautionary note, this is Florida International University a couple of years ago. This only killed 6, this outdoor walkway collapse. Again, entirely preventable series of failures in management overriding design considerations, changing blueprints at the last minute, right? These things tend to happen the same way. But anyway, so the point being, it's not like there's a perfect world to learn from here. It's not like you can point there somewhere and say, just do that, and you're out of the woods. But nonetheless, lessons to be drawn. So what's the difference between software disasters and things like what I've just shown you? Well, one is they tend to have less direct human cost, some exceptions, but another thing is they're not simply caused by structural failures. There's much more often malicious actors, especially these days, in terms of data breaches, malware, ransomware, blah, blah, blah. A lot of times what people talk about are simply failed projects, things where people devote like 2 years of their life to, and then it just doesn't go anywhere and it stops. So it's not a disaster in the same way. Other times they can, even if they don't have the same direct costs, they can have a sort of vast cost in terms of the amount of people affected, because just, you have network or service downtime in any central cloud service or backbone of the internet, and this is going to touch on millions of people all over the world to some degree, even if it's a minor inconvenience each. Something they have in common is that they're largely preventable, and something where we fall down is to the extent there are postmortems and investigations. Very often you get a technical answer, but you don't have the answer of what really happened, which is to say, what was the entire process that led to the sign off on this, instead of, some poor schmo, pushed the wrong button and that's why this happened. It's like, well, how did you get into a position where this person was going to push this button? So this is where I'm going to start, and I'm going to go some different places in this talk. I sort of gave away the game in the abstract of where I really want to go here. This used to be known in the old days as the software crisis, and here's Dijkstra talking about it in his Turing lecture from '72, where he says, well, machines grew in power, but our tools for programming machines did not grow in power correspondingly. And so therefore, we've got more and more complex systems and the same old tools, and does it any wonder everyone's falling on their face? This is a quote that you would see a lot at conferences talking about functional programming and so on, because this is one of the motivations for the languages we like to use, like Haskell, and the techniques we like to develop and talk about is managing this complexity of large-scale systems. And we've made great advances. And Dexter, in this sense, was prophetic, and he said, in one respect, one hopes tomorrow's programming languages will differ from what we're used to now. He's saying this in '72. They should invite us to reflect in the structure of what we write down, all abstractions needed to cope with this complexity and so forth. And we spend a lot of time, especially at conferences like these, building and then talking about tools that do exactly that. And I think we've done a great job with that. But that's not enough. Dijkstra recognized there were social factors that meant these tools weren't, necessarily just going to get invented and then solve everything. But I think he got these social factors very wrong, and the nature of them. And I think hopefully a lot of you would agree with me. What he's pointing to here in this quote from the same lecture is, he says, well, you just need to educate people to use these tools, and the education system doesn't lift up great intellects because it's, politically unpalatable, blah, blah, blah. Now, I think a lot of people did believe this for a long time, and this is sort of what permeates and underlies a lot of Silicon Valley beliefs to this day, right? That, well, you just have to, give the best and the brightest more and more ability, and they're just smarter and better than everyone else, so let them rise to the top. And that's what Dijkstra was saying. I think the consequences of that line of thinking have been shown not to be fruitful. So let's talk about a different approach. But asking the same question, we have done all this work to improve all our software tools, and we're getting together at conferences like these and talking about all these techniques. And but so what are the impediments? At large-scale software development at most companies. To be narrow, you might say, why aren't they taking advantage of these? But to be more broad, you might say, even when they do take advantage, things can go wrong. And there's a lot of stories about that. And here's what I would propose is another way of thinking about it, which is that, if you're not getting high quality, reliable software, maybe that's because that's not the goal. Maybe it's that simple. Well, that's not everyone's goal, at least. It's certainly mine, and I would hope yours, and something a lot of us here care about, which is why I'm talking about this at this conference. But maybe it's not everyone's goal, right? Management has a lot of other incentives, profit for one, but not only that. This is a classic book, Death March. The very fact that it's a classic book is a damning statement in itself about the state of the industry. And it's about these projects that are doomed to failure. So they're not profitable per se. This project is going to fail, but nonetheless, you're going to make people work nights and weekends for like a year straight in order to produce something that's not going to matter anyway and is going to get thrown away if it ever gets deployed. But this happens a lot in a lot of large companies. And that's because, in a large enough bureaucracy, a lot of people will have their careers on the line and be staked on the success of projects or the seeming success of projects that do not need to be successful, and everyone else gets ground up beneath it. I put here, I thought, a couple quotes from Amazon reviews that were striking, where one person all the way back in 2003 notes that when they started out in the industry, that was 30-40% of projects might have been death marches, and now it's around 70%. Here you have a much more negative review that agrees that this happens a lot, but what they don't like is, I couldn't believe one of his suggestions was to quit your job. And they go on to explain, well, that they can't quit their job. And, so that's really not an option for them. But I think for a lot of us, we do think that is the option where, if company, if a team and whatever falls apart and management changes and things aren't going well, you just move to the next job. And that's an artifact at the moment of the immense amount of bargaining power we tend to have and flexibility that has to do with the demand for engineers. It is not a constant, and it's not true for everyone. It's true for the lucky few. But we need to bear that in mind. That's not a solution, that's a workaround. But anyway, so this is just an example of the phenomenon. an extreme example. The more general point is no technical tool or development methodology can prevent management who wants to do the wrong thing from doing the wrong thing. And what I propose is, we as engineers do care a lot about building reliable software in good conditions, and but that is not necessarily the corporate structure as a whole, and there's no reason to expect it will be, especially at larger companies. And so there's a necessary tension. I'm not going to go into more examples in this talk, in part because you don't need my examples. If you've been around the block a bit and had a few jobs, had some friends and shared their experiences, you have many more examples than I can think of this problem. And anytime you have a technical problem, and the postmortem stops at the technical failures that led there, not the broader organizational failures that led there, that was actually going to be an example of this, but they just didn't let the postmortem get there. So I said, this is not a talk about fixing this. It's not a talk about good management. It's not a talk for project managers or managers, and it's not a talk about agile or this or that or the other, because there is no management technique here. This is not a problem that can be solved by management techniques. It is a problem that comes from the incentives on management. So this is instead a talk about empowering tech workers, which is to say moving the needle and shifting the balance to not only, and this is just the foot in the door in a way, is the question of reliable software, but it's also the question of working conditions, which is very related. And a good example of this is when teachers unions organize. They can make the case very effectively that they want smaller classroom sizes, and that smaller classroom sizes are good for teaching students. It's not simply that it's less work for teachers, but it benefits everybody. It benefits the product, so to speak, where education is the product. And that's something I think we face a lot, is that in some ways people who may see themselves or understand themselves to be well compensated and have a nice package of benefits or whatever, may in other ways, or be working in a very interesting field or have other upsides, may in other ways be just, in very miserable conditions due to working hours, due to crunch, or, sort of abusive management, or the precariousness of certain situations, certainly. And that will, in the end, also lead to lower quality software and worse outcomes all around, as well as just miserable employees. And we do not want to be miserable. And one thing I'll point out all these engineering failures that I pointed to, sort of in the physical world, that haven't in common with a lot of software failures I've encountered, is almost invariably, not always, but usually you are going to find the sort of hero figure who is saying, look, this is a bad idea. We shouldn't do this. We need to work this out more. We need to test this more. And they get overridden because there's a time crunch, or there's a contract reason or something where it's just not convenient to do that. So if you want reliable software, you want the people who know what's going on and, to build working systems to be able to push back on what they understand is necessary to get there, and to, provide resistance to capricious and bad decisions that will ultimately lead to problems in the end. A small way in which this happens, I think, pretty constantly in every situation I've seen, and I'm sure everyone can relate to, is there's the constant balance between paying down tech debt and developing new features. And, if you left it in the hands of some people, tech debt would never need to be paid down because they don't feel that. It's the engineers who have to deal with it every day that feel that, except at the end of the day, when there's a big problem, even if it's not directly attributable, you might say, well, it's because the system got so complex because the tech debt was never, ever, ever paid down. So you need to empower engineers to be able to fix these things and to have some say over these things, because when the balance gets too out of whack, it's a quick roller coaster ride to disaster eventually. So how do you empower workers and shift to scales is partly what we want to talk about. And Here, I'm highlighting the fact that, well, you can't be empowered simply as an individual. You have to be empowered collectively. So one thing I want to point out, this is the IEEE Code of Ethics, where the first point, I think it's a bit clearer than the ACM Code of Ethics here, is it talks about upholding the highest standards of integrity, and holding paramount safety, health, and welfare of the public, complying with ethical design and sustainable development practices, and disclosing promptly factors that might endanger the public or the environment. This is very similar to many other engineering organizations' code of ethics. I think ACM is a bit weaker here. But think about what that means, a prompt disclosure, right? If something's wrong, you let people know it's wrong, and you keep letting people know it's wrong until it gets fixed. But you know, that's asking you to put yourself out there quite a bit. And the problem is it's hard for an individual to be a hero, and they will often fail. But if they're in a situation where they're empowered, then you don't need the heroes because it's just part of the process. So what actually lets people push back against harmful management decisions, both in terms of working conditions or in terms of the quality of the work produced, or in terms of warning against dangers that may be anything from data breaches of people's sensitive information, open way to other hacks or downtime or what have you. Well, one problem is if you say this is a bad idea, I won't do it. Well, you get in trouble, but what if the next person says, okay, I'll do it? Well, so you need solidarity. You need collective organizing. You need some way of discussing what your common interests are with your coworkers in a way that's not being supervised and monitored and micromanaged by the higher ups. And you need collective bargaining to be able to present the results of these discussions and, have some negotiating weight there, which is a way to have these discussions and be listened to. And so this brings us to labor unions, the unions I'm talking about here, not unions in the type theoretic sense, the set theoretic sense. This is not something that people have talked about in the tech industry for the most part for a very long time. It's always seemed very far off. I want to make the case to you that it's still a difficult question, but it's not as far off as it maybe used to be. And I want to make the case that even for those of us who see ourselves as well compensated and in some ways, doing very well, that doesn't stand in the way of these questions, because we encounter these issues too, where, especially the question of hours and crunches, overtimes, weekends, on call, and the ability to control and negotiate that. Development schedules, ship dates, feature cutoffs. These are all places where, we ultimately have no say, absent some sort of collective bargaining over the conditions which are imposed on us, in which we're working and the product in which we're producing. Even though we may feel we have autonomy on these big questions, we absolutely don't. And when these things are gotten wrong, they can really lead to either disaster or simply just widespread misery. The question of training, and are people expected to train on company time, on their own time, or are they given company time to train, is another place which very often bone of contention, or if it's not, it should be. And something common in other engineering disciplines, it's in fact in their code of ethics, but which never seems to come up, which is related to training, is the question of the right to refuse unqualified work. We very much are in a situation where software engineers are supposed to just work with whatever is thrown at them, sort of willy-nilly. So these are all things that can and should be negotiated for, instead of just accepting whatever comes our way. Plenty of other, and then the problem is I could give the whole talk just running down all the stuff that I'm sure we've all run into in various ways. So just, skim through this slide. Very often also you may think you're in a very good situation, and you may be. But then a month later, a year later, there's some management change, and all of a sudden the good situation turns terrible. And I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of this and I've seen of this. There's a team that just sounds absolutely great, and then something happens way up the reporting chain, and that's it. The whole project is scrapped, and this happens over and over in the industry. And again, if it's skilled people, well, they'll eventually find a new job somewhere else, and try to build another team that does well again and works on interesting projects. But what if that didn't have to happen? What if you could actually have some line of defense over these capricious management changes and over, this wholesale precarity? Wouldn't that be nice? What if you had some actual protections from HR and the ability to have a representative when a manager filed a malicious complaint against you or something? Wouldn't that be nice? This is things that unions can do, and collective organizing can help with, along with wages and benefits and all of that. So I think most of us in the industry have had times where we would have benefited from this. But of course, for the most part, there is no such thing. I will apologize here that I'm giving a relatively US-centric point of view. There's not a lot of tech organizing generally, I believe, but of course, in the US, I believe it's particularly bad. And one excuse I will give here is that because the tech industry is so US-centric in a way, the tech sector is worse than off than the rest of the workforce in this way. And because the tech is so US-centric, the US has, in a sense, exported its bad conditions to elsewhere in the world. But I know there's a lot I'm not covering because conditions are very different in different countries. So I apologize for that, especially at a very international conference, which is a very cool thing. And then of course, I'm not even going into the games industry, which is its own set of particular horror stories, a lot of which are in the news these days, but which I'm less familiar with. But a lot of these problems are presented in extremis in the games industry as well. All right, let's move on a bit here. This is a slide that many people are probably familiar with everything but the red line, where you have the great divergence between hourly compensation and productivity. Crypto coin advocates and people like to point to it and say, look, this divergence happened right around the time that the US went off the gold standard, but this, when you add in the red line, it suggests at least another component, if not an entirely different relation here, which is that the long-term decline of unionism and labor organizing has been very bad for the conditions of workers, and tech workers may have felt exempt from this, but we're not. And it's also worse because we're maybe skilled engineers, but most jobs are in one way or another that are being created are, quote, tech jobs in some sense, including some of the most miserable jobs today. A lot of gig work, Uber drivers, Amazon warehouse workers, and so on, which have also been centers of tech organizing. And I think it's important to think of tech as a sector and industrial unionism, and see ourselves and those people as having certain things in common, to the extent that we share employers and so forth, rather than seeing, looking at that and saying, oh, that's terrible, but viewing it as sort of a question where we just feel very sad about the conditions of others. So that was then. This is maybe now. This is why I think things are maybe, there's possibilities, which is why I wanted to talk to you about this. This is an audience of early adopters. So, we should be thinking about these questions. You can see that after reaching a real low point of approval in really the late 2000s, American approval of unions, again, sorry for the American-centric view here, has been rising steadily ever since, and certainly a series of recessions and economic crashes, along with horrors of the pandemic and so forth, have, I think, helped people to come around to realizing that people who, work and then, have the product that they produce, sold by others, have an interest in organizing together, and so it's really quite striking, both the decline and then the consistent increase. And now you have an article. This is a very small survey size, but where Protocol, it's a new publication that covers the tech industry, says, well, at least by some small surveys, up to half of the tech workforce now wants to join a union. Vast increase over years prior, even bearing in mind the survey size. So here's stuff that has all happened in the last year, some of which you may have been following and heard about. Under the Communications Workers of America, CWA, there's the Code CWA initiative for organizing software developers and engineers. Probably the biggest, most prominent thing that's happened was the organization of a small subset of Google workers into the Alphabet Workers Union. That's a minority union, so it doesn't really give them any collective bargaining or sort of right to negotiate a contract or anything. But it does mean that they have certain protections, which is very important, because if you're speaking up about workplace conditions and, the employer might not like that and they might try to push you out. But at least ostensibly under U.S. labor law, and I don't know, is it varies country by country, being even in a minority union without bargaining rights gives you protections that let you sort of give you some legal standing if you're victimized by agitating about the conditions in your workplace. And they've had some small wins among areas in raising conditions and just even helping people know the rights that they do have as workers and discussing their pay and conditions for, I think in particular, data center workers, but not only. So, and then there's groups like Every Action was just announced, I think, in the last couple of weeks. It's a large, progressive sort of, organizing software sort of company. And so that was a voluntary union recognition by the employer because, they want to, it's a progressive company and they want to sort of show that they have progressive values. So but nonetheless, that's 240 plus people now in a tech bargaining unit, which would have been unimaginable, right? Mapbox had a very large effort that for now failed. I'll get back to that, but it was pretty inspiring as it was occurring. Medium, again, had a very large effort, but that was cut short. Ongoing, what would be the largest tech bargaining unit, New York Times tech workers. They're currently in a bunch of litigation about exactly who gets to be qualified or not as a tech worker. So the Times is pushing back. But because as a whole, the journalism industry is relatively highly unionized and New York Times is relatively highly unionized, they're probably actually going to get somewhere, and that's going to be really good. And you might say all these examples are pretty small or whatever, but the point is they're beginning examples for what had been a very, very barren landscape before, and a landscape before where, there was people really were afraid to even talk about this. And now I'm less afraid to talk about it. So I'm happy to talk to you about it and say, look, this is something that, it isn't impossible and isn't happening nowhere. OPIU, the big success story is Kickstarter United, which is still negotiating its contract, but Kickstarter tech employees did unionize last year. And on the basis of that, I think on the basis at least, they've launched the Tech 1010 initiative, which has a number of other organization efforts underway, but I don't think they're really ready to talk about any of those publicly yet. And then, of course, there's been a lot of stories and groups about organizing Amazon warehouse workers. There was a large contract for Bazerman that was hard fought and lost, but it's under litigation. Good work and Uber driver. So there's a lot that's been going on, and this is all really just in the last year. And compared to years prior, it is night and day. So I would hope that it doesn't stop anytime soon and that momentum continues. So it's something we can be talking about. Here's a cautionary note. This is what Mapbox described as what happened to their effort. They went in with a supermajority on cards, right? Which is to say, they had gotten many, the vast supermajority of the workforce to sign cards saying they wanted a union. At which point the employer could have said voluntarily, okay, we believe the cards. But instead, they said, we don't believe the cards. And so we're going to force a vote. And there was a 7-week campaign prior to the vote in which there was just an enormous amount of fear, uncertainty, and doubt spread about unions. And so then they, they did not win the vote. And that is something that happens a lot, right? Is that one should not be naive about these things. It's not as easy as just saying, "Hey, we'd like this," and we've convinced a majority we'd like this. At every step of the way, it's really fraught with the possibility of failure, and it's fraught with risk. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, but I also think it's very important for some of the reasons I've motivated, and for plenty others I haven't had a chance to motivate. One point I'd add here is, so what can you do in the face of this? I'm not saying, hey, everyone start a union tomorrow. It's not that easy. I'm saying start thinking about it. It's okay to have these conversations. Educate yourself maybe about some of the stuff that has been happening, and see if it's even really a possibility. Every organizing effort begins with a few coworkers talking to each other about whether or not they think this is something that's realistic, and then a few more getting involved and keeping very under the radar. There's a lot of pointed resources, trainings available, and other ways to inform yourself more. Just start looking at the world in a different way. Start asking the questions about what would it mean if there were a union, or what would it mean if, even if there wasn't a union, if we had more collective bargaining and negotiating power in any of the sorts of decisions that get made, and we're more empowered to push back against management decisions, right? It doesn't have to start at a union. It doesn't end there, but it certainly doesn't have to start there. There's ways to begin organizing about these sorts of things that are much sooner. But, and so be cautious and be safe, and expect a lot of blowback and a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but also don't be so scared that you never look towards this, is what I would ask. And this is, I think, something that comes up a lot, and which is the question of solidarity, which I know I'm conscious about always at work, which is very often we don't see the divisions as between, sort of management and, those who are doing the stuff. Instead, we will tend to align with our own managers against other teams and their managers, right? And view many of the frustrations that come up in our day-to-day work as, well, this team does this or that team does that, and we don't have the human empathy to say, well, these conflicts are set up by the structure of how things are organized, and the varying, maybe too intensive demands placed on the various teams. It's not the individuals on these teams that we should be viewing as the people we're in conflict with. And that's always hard to remember, but it's important that if you ever want to get anywhere. And I think this is important as well, sort of, especially in international companies where divisions in different countries can, get very territorial with one another. And also, well, it can be the engineers versus the ops team, or so forth, so I think that's important. There's all these things cut against solidarity necessary for good organizing, and cut against their own interests ultimately. I think it's important not to think of this stuff, and not to think of these questions as social work, or just those poor warehouse workers, if you share the employer with these people, right? These are your coworkers, and it's important not to get too drawn into courts or legalistic strategies, and which can dissipate momentum, and understand, well, what really matters is you and the people you work with, and expanding that understanding of solidarity and common interest, part of which is, a common interest in, having good conditions to build a good product, and to do your job well, right? So this is not in contrast to doing your job well. This is about all the things that we need to do our job well, besides simply, having really cool, shiny new GHC features, which is, to be in a position where we can actually do it well, in terms of the control we have over our working conditions, and over the decisions about what we're building and how we're building. And again, I want to underline, this is not simply, a question for when things are really bad, right? You don't just buy health insurance, once you've got a bad diagnosis. You need it all along. Similarly, if you're, you don't if you're like, man, I really wish I had some, collective organizing now, it's probably almost already too late to do it. It never is too late, but it's much more late than it should be. You should have started a long time ago. So that's something. It's not just for when situations are dire. And as I said, this is really different than most talks I've given, and most talks maybe at this conference or elsewhere, in that it's not about something I know how to do. It's about something I think should happen, but if I knew how to do it, I'd do it. But also it's not something that any individual can do. It's something that has to be figured out together with one another. And it's a really important problem. And another difference from technical problems is, well, if you're like, oh, well, let me write the code this way, then let me write it that way, and then let me benchmark it. So experiments are relatively cheap. They burn CPU power or CI time in software. Every lesson that you learn when you're trying to organize is expensive in terms of time, in terms of potential danger, in terms of what's at stake. So it's a very different situation. So I just want to highlight that again, the seriousness. But here we go. Nothing happens if we're not even talking about it. And it's okay to talk about it now. And the code of silence that used to be around, I think, is now a bit shattered. So we'll find out. But everything starts somewhere. And as I'm saying, not only is there not enough time, but everyone's going to have their own stories, their own examples. And something I want to highlight is when I was first saying, look, am I going to get interested in Haskell way back when? And what I used to do is I used to go, and every time there was a bug that was my fault, and I'd go through a mental postmortem in my own head and say, why was this bug? Oh, I wrote it like this, and I did this. And then I would say, okay, well, I'm really considering getting into functional programming. If I'd been doing things, the Haskell way in, a functional language, how would I have written things differently so this bug couldn't occur? And then after I had a long enough list, I said, that's it, I'm starting writing Haskell. So start asking those questions maybe about things that go wrong at work. Is, this situation, if we had more collective bargaining power, would we be in this situation, or would we be able to deal with it differently? And if the list gets long enough, then maybe you can say, well, this is something I need to take much more seriously. So let's talk in so much sense just to pose that question to you, and to point you to some resources if you do want to pursue that question. And here they are. The Tech Workers Coalition, which is more of just a group of where people can get together and talk about these things and share resources and point each other to other resources, but can be very useful in that regard. And there's chapters around the US and the world of that. And then here's two US-centric unions organizing efforts I've talked about, Code CWA and Tech 1010. And the Kickstarter union organizing effort produced an oral history podcast. It's about 9 or 10 episodes, which is really interesting. And it goes through the whole process of start to finish of how they started to think about questions of organizing and how that discussion spread throughout the company and where it ended up. And it raised a lot of broader concerns that sort of propelled them in that direction. So I would encourage people to listen to that and check it out, because it's sort of a unique artifact describing some of these changes that have been happening in the tech industry. And that's what I have in the slides. So I'm curious what discussion there will be. And thanks for bearing with me on a very different talk.
Hey, thank you. That was awesome. Everybody, please join the special chat where Gershom is going to be answering the Q&A. And let's move there.